A Filipino caregiver spent 22 years taking care of a quiet old man in Austria. When he died, she expected to pack her things, collect her final pay, and go home. Instead, she was handed a letter. Inside it was a decision that would change her life and trigger a legal battle his own family was determined to win. 3 days after the funeral, Remedios sat in a notarial office in Graz, Austria, holding an envelope with her name written carefully across the front. She had been told to bring her documents, nothing more. Across from her sat the dead man's family, his son, his sister, and a cousin who had driven in that morning with the quiet confidence of someone expecting an inheritance. No one spoke to her. They barely looked at her. To them, she was just the Filipino caregiver their father had hired years ago, a background presence, necessary perhaps, but invisible. The notary entered. Papers were arranged. The room settled into a silence that felt procedural, almost routine. Then he began to read, and somewhere between the legal phrasing and the formal language, the direction of everything in that room shifted. Because the estate, 11 hectares of land, a farmhouse, and everything tied to it had not been left to the family. It had been left to her. Remedios did not react. Not outwardly. She had spent most of her life learning how to receive things, good or bad, without spectacle. But in that moment, something inside her stalled. Not disbelief, not even shock. Just a quiet pause, as though her mind needed time to understand how her name had found its way into a place it was never meant to be. Across the table, the reaction was different. The cousin spoke first, loud, immediate, sharp. The son said nothing, which was somehow worse. The air in the room changed. And though no one said it yet, something had already begun. A challenge. To understand how she got there, you have to go back. Not to Austria, but to a barangay outside Ormoc, where mornings smelled of wood smoke and fermented fish, and where Remedios first learned what it meant to care for another human being. Her grandmother was a midwife. She had no formal education, no certificates, no titles, but she carried a kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. From her, Remedios learned something simple and difficult. That the highest form of respect you can give someone is not sympathy, but attention. To sit beside another person, fully present, without needing to fix them, impress them, or be seen. That lesson stayed. It followed her through nursing school in Cebu, through long hospital shifts where supplies ran out, but patients never did. And eventually into a decision that would take her thousands of kilometers away from home. The job in Austria came through an agency in Makati. It was standard, legal, straightforward. An elderly man, widowed, living alone on a large property in a rural part of the country. The notes described him as reserved, difficult, attached to routine. Remedios read the file on the plane and thought only one thing. He sounds like my Lolo. She arrived in November. The trees were bare. The air felt heavier than anything she had known back home. Wilhelm Hartmann met her at the door. He did not smile. He showed her her room, listed his medications, explained his schedule. Then he turned and walked away, without asking her name. Remedios noticed that. She also noticed the dishes in the sink, the unopened letters, the photograph above the fireplace of a woman laughing in a garden, a moment frozen in a house that no longer felt alive. She did not comment on any of it. That first night, she made soup, placed a bowl outside his study door, and went to sleep. By the third week, he was calling her by name. By the second month, he was talking. Not constantly, not easily, but enough. And not because she asked the right questions, but because she didn't. Remedios had a way of listening that most people never learn. She didn't interrupt silence. She didn't rush to comfort. She didn't turn someone else's pain into something easier to carry. She simply stayed. And over time, that became something Hartman had not realized he needed. The years passed quietly. Contracts renewed, flights back and forth between Austria and the Philippines, life narrowing into a rhythm that few people saw. She managed his medications, drove him to appointments, sat beside him through recovery after surgery, through frustration, through long afternoons where nothing was said at all. There were moments he lost patience, moments he spoke sharply. She didn't take it personally. She adjusted, continued, returned the next morning as though nothing had been broken. There were things she gave up. Other nurses from her class built careers abroad, Canada, Dubai, New Zealand. They gained titles, promotions, recognition. Remedios stayed in one house, caring for one man, doing work that left no visible mark. And she never once tried to turn it into something bigger than it was, because to her, it already was. Hartman had a son, Friedrich. He visited twice a year. He brought expensive wine, talked about markets and politics, stayed a few days, then left. He was not unkind, but he was not present. He referred to Remedios as the Filipino woman my father hired, which was accurate and completely wrong. Because what Friedrich never saw, what no one saw, was the way his father changed. Slowly, quietly, over years. The case did not begin with shouting. It began with paperwork, formal letters, legal language, carefully worded accusations that never raised their voice but carried the weight of something personal underneath. Friedrich and his cousin did not argue that the will was fake. They argued something harder to disprove, that it had been influenced, that a man in his final years, isolated, aging, dependent, could have been guided, slowly and subtly, toward a decision that was never fully his own. That the woman who lived with him, who managed his days, who occupied the quiet spaces of his life, had shaped the outcome. They did not need to prove malice, only doubt. Remedios read the letters more than once, not because she didn't understand them, but because she was trying to understand what they meant beyond the words. How 22 years of routine, of presence, of care, could be reframed into something transactional, something calculated, something suspicious. She did not respond emotionally. She did what she had always done. She continued. The garden still needed tending. The house still needed heat. The small, ordinary systems that kept the estate alive did not pause for legal disputes. So she woke up before dawn, as she always had, walked the same paths, prepared the same meals, even though there was no one left to serve them to. Because routine, for her, was not tied to recognition. It was tied to responsibility. The first court hearing was scheduled in Graz. Remedios arrived early. Not because she was anxious, but because she believed in being on time. It was a habit formed long before Austria, long before Hartman, long before any of this. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was restrained. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just a process unfolding slowly. Friedrich spoke through his lawyer, measured, controlled. He described his father as a man who had grown increasingly dependent, a man who had withdrawn, a man whose world had, over time, narrowed to a single constant presence. And then, carefully, the suggestion that such dependence creates vulnerability. Remedios listened. She did not interrupt. She did not react. But for the first time, the silence she carried felt different, not peaceful, observed. Her lawyer, a Filipino-Austrian woman based in Graz, did not rush. She did not attempt to counter emotion with emotion. Instead, she focused on something quieter, evidence. Not grand gestures, not declarations of loyalty, but the ordinary details of a life lived over 2 decades. Medical records, travel documents, employment contracts renewed consistently, without irregularity. Proof that Hartman had managed his finances independently. Proof that his will had been prepared in the presence of a notary with no one else in the room. But what shifted the case did not come from documents. It came from letters. Dozens of them, written by Hartman over the last 10 years of his life to a retired colleague in Klagenfurt. They were not written for court. They were not written for defense. They were written because he had found, late in life, someone he trusted enough to speak honestly to. In those letters, he spoke about many things: his health, his memories of his wife, his frustrations with aging. But again and again he returned to one subject: Remedios. He did not describe her as an employee. He did not describe her as help. He described her as something far more difficult to define. In one letter he wrote that she had restored a rhythm to his life. In another, that conversations with her were the most meaningful he had experienced in years. And in one, written in unsteady handwriting, he said something the court would later return to more than once: that trusting her had not been a weakness, but a correction. When those letters were read in court, something changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough, because they introduced something the accusation had not accounted for: intent. This was not a man being guided. This was a man deciding. Slowly, deliberately, over years. The proceedings stretched. Weeks turned into months. Each session adding small pieces, small clarifications, small shifts in understanding. There was no single moment of victory, no dramatic turning point, only accumulation. Through it all, Remedios remained where she had always been, at the estate. She did not leave. Even when advised she could. Even when the uncertainty stretched longer than expected, she stayed. Maintained the house. Managed the land. Tended the garden that had once been something they shared. There were days when nothing seemed to move forward. Days when the case felt suspended in place. On those days, she returned to routine. Because routine did not ask questions. It did not doubt. It simply continued. Friedrich visited once during the proceedings. He arrived without notice. Stayed for 2 days. Walked through the house as though measuring it against memory. They spoke very little. Only what was necessary. She prepared his meals. Placed them where he could find them. Just as she had done for his father. At one point, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her, as though trying to understand something he had never taken the time to see before. He did not apologize. He did not accuse. He simply said, "I didn't know." It was the closest either of them came to acknowledging what stood between them. When he left, the house returned to silence. But not the same silence as before. The final hearing came more than a year after the challenge was filed. By then, the case had lost its initial tension. Not because it no longer mattered, but because everything that could be said had already been placed on record. The decision, when it came, was delivered without drama. The court found no evidence of coercion, no evidence of manipulation, no indication that Wilhelm Hartmann had acted under pressure or confusion. Instead, it recognized something simpler and far more difficult to argue against: that a man of sound mind made a decision, and that the law did not require that decision to be fair, only that it be his. The estate remained with Remedios. Friedrich filed an appeal.
it was dismissed. And just like that, after 14 months of proceedings, arguments, and quiet endurance, the fight was over.
But what remained was not victory, not in the way people expect, because what she had been given was not just land, not just property, not just inheritance. It was something far heavier, a life she had never planned for. The morning after the appeal was dismissed, Remedios woke before sunrise, not because she had to, but because she always had. For years, her mornings had belonged to someone else. Medications to prepare, meals to plan, a routine shaped around another person's needs. But that morning, for the first time, there was no schedule waiting for her, no voice in the next room, no list to follow, just silence. She stepped outside into the cold air of the Styrian foothills and began to walk, the same path she had taken hundreds of times before, past the edge of the house, along the narrow stretch where the grass grew uneven, toward the south side of the property where the garden had slowly taken shape over the years. The land looked the same. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She walked without rushing, not thinking about the court, not thinking about the family, not even thinking about what came next, just walking. When she reached the garden, she stopped. The okra had grown wild again, unstructured, uncontained, spreading in ways that would have bothered Hartman at first before he learned to let it. She stood there for a long time, not measuring the land, not claiming it, not trying to understand what it meant, just standing. Whatever passed through her in that moment, she never explained to anyone, and no one ever asked. Because Remedios was not someone who narrated her own life. She lived it, quietly, fully, without needing to turn it into something others could easily understand. The legal process that followed was slower, less dramatic, but necessary. Ownership, in reality, is paperwork, transfers, taxes, signatures, verifications, things that take time, things that turn a court decision into something tangible. She hired a lawyer in Graz, met with officials, learned systems she had never expected to navigate, and when it was done, when everything had been signed, confirmed, and transferred, the estate was no longer something she lived in, it was something she owned. Back in Ormoc, her mother had been praying every morning since the case began, a quiet routine of its own. When Remedios finally called to say it was over, the conversation was short. Her mother cried, softly, the way people cry when relief arrives slowly after being held back for too long. Remedios listened, then said only, "Nanay, hindi pa tapos." It's not finished. Because for her, this was never the end of a story, it was the beginning of a responsibility. She did not sell the land. That would have been the simplest choice, the most practical, the most expected. But she stayed. She worked with a small agricultural cooperative in the village, learned how to manage the forested hectares, expanded the garden not as a project, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. The farmhouse was repaired slowly, carefully, not modernized beyond recognition, not transformed into something new, but preserved. The old stone fireplace remained, the wooden beams, the quiet weight of a place that had existed long before her, and now, somehow, included her. And above the mantel, the photograph stayed, the woman in the garden, laughing, unchanged. Remedios dusted it the same way she always had, once a week, without fail. In her second year, she began writing letters, not legal letters, not formal requests, simple ones, to a nursing college in Leyte. She asked about scholarships, what it would take, how it could be structured. The first one was small, just enough to support a single student, a girl from a barangay not far from where she had grown up. At the small ceremony where it was announced, they asked Remedios why she chose to do it. She didn't mention the inheritance. She didn't mention Austria.
she didn't mention the court. She simply said that her own education had been made possible by people she had never met, and that it felt right to continue that. Nothing more. Back in Austria, the seasons continued as they always had. Winter settled over the hills. Spring returned. The garden grew. The house held its quiet. Friedrich never came back. Whether he accepted what had happened or carried it as something unresolved was not something Remedios tried to find out. Some stories close cleanly. This one didn't.